If a 13th century European noble were to sit down in a 3-star Michelin restaurant today, he would probably be deeply confused. Why does the finest cuisine no longer use the most expensive spices? Over 700 years ago, many of Europe's most elite banquets tended to heavily use pepper, cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg. Today, however, many Western dishes influenced by French haute cuisine emphasize minimalist seasoning instead, letting the ingredients speak for themselves. So, why did Europeans' idea of what tastes good change? And who decides what counts as delicious? In this episode, we'll start with spices to see how European standards of taste were redefined. Today, if someone were to sprinkle a plate of roast meat with cinnamon, cloves, ginger, and black pepper all at once, people would probably think they'd gone mad. Yet 700 years ago, at Europe's most elite banquets, that was exactly how people ate. Not just roast meat and fish, but even desserts were piled high with spices from the east, and the more important the banquet, the more spices there were. Why on earth was this? Some might say there were no refrigerators in the Middle Ages, so Europeans had to use massive amounts of spices to mask the flavor of spoiled food. This sounds reasonable, but it has a fatal flaw. Because the people who could actually afford these expensive spices happened to be Europe's wealthiest nobles. They owned their own manors and hunting grounds, and had access to food sources that were far fresher and more stable than those of ordinary people. Therefore, the spoiled food theory doesn't seem to hold up. What else could the reason be then? Nearly all the spices that drove medieval European nobles wild did not grow in Europe. Black pepper came from the southwestern coast of India. Cinnamon came from Sri Lanka. Cloves and nutmeg grew in the Spice Islands of eastern Indonesia. To the Europeans of that era, those places were practically the ends of the earth. For a single peppercorn to reach Europe, it usually had to pass through Arab merchants, traverse the Red Sea trade routes before being traded into the hands of Venetian merchants. By the time it finally appeared on a European noble's dinner table, its price had become so high that it was completely unaffordable for ordinary people. Therefore, spices were never just seasonings. They were a symbol of wealth. When a nobleman put spices into the pot, he was telling all his guests, "I can afford to place the most expensive things from the other side of the world on my table." From that moment on, at the tables of the aristocracy, wealth became an important standard for defining what was considered refined, and spices became the culinary symbol of this logic of wealth. But wealth can only explain why nobles loved to display spices. It still cannot explain why spices were added to almost every dish. Could it really have been just about making food taste better? Take, for example, the most famous noble beverage of the Middle Ages, Hippocras. People added massive amounts of cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and nutmeg to wine. Or take another example, there was a dessert specifically served to kings called râpé. The cook would crush figs and raisins, boil them down in red wine, and thicken the sauce with breadcrumbs. Right before plating, they would not only sprinkle pepper, but also stir in cinnamon, saffron, and honey. And its defining touch was a thick layer of freshly shaved ginger added just before serving. Adding heavy amounts of spices to so many different kinds of ingredients, explaining this simply as being for the taste, doesn't seem to work either. Could it be that behind these flavors lay a body of knowledge they deeply believed in? Today, we rely on nutritional science. We know to eat eggs for protein and bread for carbohydrates. In medieval Europe, however, there was also a dietary theory about health, the humoral theory. This theory held that the human body maintains its balance through 4 humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Illness was simply the result of this balance being disrupted. And people back then believed that all ingredients in the world possess inherent qualities of being dry, wet, cold, or hot. They also believed that these properties affected the body's internal balance. For instance, at the time, the nature of fish was often classified as extremely cold and extremely wet. Eating it directly was believed to increase the body's cold and dampness, disrupting its internal balance. Therefore, people would often add pepper and cinnamon, which were considered to have warming properties, to restore that balance. In other words, eating back then was not just about satisfying hunger, it was also a method for maintaining bodily equilibrium. When spices carried the authority of both wealth and health, they became, in the eyes of European nobles, the very definition of the right way to eat. But the question is, if it was once considered so correct, why did the later generations change the standard of judgment? Many people might think that it was the market that changed everything. In 1498, the Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached India. For Europe, the opening of this new sea route finally broke the monopoly held by Middle Eastern merchants. By the 17th century, with the entry of the Dutch and British East India companies, the global trade network took full shape and massive merchant ships sailed back to Europe loaded with pepper and cloves. Over the next 100 years, as spices shifted from niche luxury items into everyday seasonings affordable to commoners, they began to lose the very thing that had marked them as symbols of status, their rarity. Historically, silk and luxury porcelain share the exact same fate. Once they became accessible, they were no longer considered luxurious. True, the market did destroy the myth of spice as wealth, but this still isn't enough to explain why spices couldn't even hold on to their status as a symbol of health. In this game of flavor, we need to clarify one fact. Who was defining this healthy way of eating? You see, in the minds of medieval Europeans, between cooking and medicine, there was almost none of the clear boundaries we see today. In that era, cooking was not just about making food taste good, it was about strictly executing a doctor's prescription. But as spices became more widespread, people began to realize that the same spices did not automatically produce the health effects people expected. In 1628, William Harvey published De Motu Cordis, redefining how blood circulates in the human body. By the 1650s, new scientific concepts began comparing the human body to a precise machine. In the eyes of medical scholars, the stomach was no longer a medicinal furnace fueled by spices, but an organ like a mill that ground up food through physical movement. Though this shift in perspective took over a century, the absolute authority of eating pepper to balance your humors had already begun to crack. At this moment, chefs and gourmands also began searching for new aesthetic standards. What, after all, should a dish truly strive for? In 1651, the famous French chef François-Pierre de la Varenne published Le Cuisinier François. He began reducing the heavy use of spices in medieval cooking, searching for an entirely new direction in cuisine. From this point forward, spices not only lost the rarity that had made them symbols of wealth, but also began to lose the authority granted to them by medicine. A standard of taste that had ruled European tables for centuries was slowly collapsing. But after the old standard collapsed, who built the new one? And why did it ultimately become the elite standard that aristocrats across Europe sought to imitate? The first person that comes to mind is King Louis XIV of France. Let's roll back the clock to the 17th of August 1661. On this day, the French Superintendent of Finance, Nicolas Fouquet, hosted a lavish banquet that would go down in history. Solid gold tableware, meticulously manicured French gardens, and an exquisite feast presented by the top chefs of the era. Every single detail silently flaunted wealth and taste. In the eyes of Louis XIV, who craved absolute royal power, the wealth and influence Fouquet possessed was encroaching on a level a king could never tolerate in a subject. This banquet, therefore, was no longer just a display of luxury. It became a public symbol of an imbalance of power. Just 3 weeks later, Fouquet was arrested and ultimately sentenced to life imprisonment. But it is worth noting that Fouquet's downfall was not triggered by this banquet alone. What truly cost him Louis XIV's trust stemmed from long-accumulated political tensions and financial mismanagement. This banquet was merely the final straw that broke the camel's back. Afterward, Louis XIV did not destroy what Fouquet had showcased. Instead, he directly co-opted his team of designers, landscape architects, and chefs, and built the largest theater of power in human history on the outskirts of Paris, the Palace of Versailles. A new experiment in haute cuisine immediately unfolded there. Since spices were no longer scarce thanks to the age of discovery, the royal court had to play a brand new game that ordinary people simply couldn't play. To eat seasonal vegetables like asparagus and green peas earlier than anyone else, Louis XIV built a massive royal kitchen garden right next to Versailles. The gardeners utilized the horticultural techniques like thick walls and hotbeds, even laying down vast amounts of horse manure, using the heat generated by fermentation to bring the crops to harvest earlier. This allowed fresh ingredients that would normally only be available in another season to appear on the king's table months in advance. The bright green peas that took the court by storm at the time were exalted as the ultimate luxury item. Noble women would even secretly snack on freshly picked peas right before bed, a craze comparable to people in China today rushing to buy limited edition designer bags. This obsessive pursuit of freshness and the natural flavor of ingredients became the new battlefield for the aristocracy to set themselves apart from the rest of society. Looking at it this way, you might assume that it was Louis XIV, his absolute power, and the kitchens of Versailles that redefined what delicious meant and what constituted the standard of refinement. But why couldn't it have been a king from another country? Was it that other royal families couldn't afford luxurious palaces or top-tier chefs? Not at all. What truly forced the entire European aristocracy to abandon centuries-old eating preferences was never a moment of sheer authoritarian power. Rather, it was the aesthetic and cultural inertia that France, during its golden age, had already deeply embedded into the very bones of foreign nobility. France, during the reign of Louis XIV, was the undisputed hegemon of Europe, possessing one of the most formidable financial capacities of the time. More importantly, France systematically packaged its language, theater, fashion, and cuisine into a supreme standard representing true civilization. Wherever French power went, its aesthetic hegemony followed. This overwhelming advantage produced one of history's greatest ironies. Even toward the end of Louis XIV's reign, when France was being battered on the battlefield by a European coalition, the cultural hegemony accumulated over the previous decades had already created a powerful lagging effect. Monarchs of other nations fought to the death against France on the battlefield, while back home, they copied French administrative systems and the blueprints of Versailles almost wholesale. That plate of green peas, championed by Versailles, stripped of Eastern spices and seasoned only with salt and butter, naturally became a vital symbol of civilization and nobility. Nobles in Britain, Germany, and even Sweden frantically hired French chefs, translated French cookbooks, and wouldn't even eat a meal without adhering to French etiquette. Within this cultural hurricane forged by political power, the pursuit of the natural flavor of ingredients spread alongside the expanding influence of French aesthetics, ultimately becoming one of the prime targets of imitation for the 18th century European aristocracy. Up to this point, the historical logic sounded flawless, but no hegemony lasts forever. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted. The once invincible palace of Versailles was ransacked by an angry populace, and those once haughty French nobles who had made the green peas the mark of refinement lined up to be sent to the guillotine. Logically speaking, since the absolute power that created this aesthetic system had gone up in smoke, this incredibly expensive game of natural flavor should have been discarded by history along with the blood of the aristocrats. Yet, strangely enough, it did not vanish. Instead, over the next 2 centuries, it gradually stepped out of the royal courts and became the global benchmark for what defines good food today. So, who exactly was it that transformed this game of natural flavor once reserved for kings into something ordinary people could enjoy? Many people might give a seemingly obvious explanation: human taste has simply progressed. With the development of society, people came to realize that heavily spiced foods, sometimes even those with the smell of spoilage, were backward, whereas light, healthy food that respected the natural flavor of ingredients was the ultimate destination of human taste evolution. This sounds heartwarming, civilized, and full of hope, but it is, in reality, a deeply arrogant modern lie. The only reason we can sit in air-conditioned restaurants today, elegantly discussing the dignity of ingredients or the seasonality of the terroir, is not because our tongues are more sophisticated than those of our ancestors, but simply because we are fortunate. For a long time after the revolution, people were still confronted by a harsh technological constraint. In an era without modern transportation and refrigeration, while the highest-ranking nobles could rely on privilege to enjoy freshly slaughtered meat and live fish from their estates, the dinner tables of the vast majority of ordinary people were dominated by heavily salted meat and dried fish preserved for storage. People of the past did not lack an appreciation for the natural taste of fresh ingredients. Rather, in an era of technological limitations, allowing freshness and the natural flavor of ingredients to survive across seasons and long distances was an immense luxury. So, what exactly completely shattered this physical constraint? The Industrial Revolution of the 19th century blanketed the European continent with a dense network of railroad tracks. Transit routes that used to take weeks could now be covered by a train in a single day. Soon after, the vapor compression refrigeration system was invented. Modern cold storage facilities, refrigerated railcars, and household refrigerators rapidly became widespread. This allowed freshness to reliably reach more people's dinner tables. People no longer needed to rely on large amounts of salt and spices to mask flaws in their ingredients. The French aristocracy defined the standard, and the subsequent Industrial Revolution began to truly spread that standard throughout society. If things had actually continued down this path, European dinner tables should have become more and more French. But while technology can change how food is preserved, it cannot erase what the land has shaped. When we walk through everyday neighborhoods across Europe today, we immediately discover a fascinating reality. In Germany, it's sizzling, fatty roasted pork knuckles and smoked sausages. In Italy, it's fresh basil, garlic, and ripe tomatoes. In Spain, it's rustic seafood stews rich with garlic and olive oil. Why is it that even though modern cold chains are so advanced, local people remain deeply enamored with these bold, intense flavors? Because what France changed was the social code of the elite. Regional food traditions, on the other hand, were shaped by local geography, climate, and centuries of survival wisdom. Looking north, in Central and Northern Europe, where climates are frigid and winters long, people had to preserve food to survive the winter, which gave rise to bold culinary traditions of smoking, air drying, and fermentation. Looking south, along the Mediterranean coast, abundant sunshine naturally gifted them with rich olive oils, robust herbs, and garlic, where people grew accustomed to celebrating the vibrant freshness of their produce. While French court cuisine kept stripping dishes back to showcase privilege, the rustic kitchens across Europe continued to preserve rich, bold culinary traditions shaped by their local land. Therefore, what France changed was never everyone's sense of taste. Yet, strangely enough, whenever people began to discuss the finest cuisine, France gradually became the world's reference point. Why was it that a niche aesthetic, once reserved for courts and nobles, ultimately stepped outside the palace of Versailles and shaped the entire world's imagination of fine dining? For an aesthetic to truly spread, it is not enough for people to simply like it. It must become a system that can be learned, replicated, and evaluated. At the end of the 19th century, with the development of railways and the steamships, the era of travel for the global bourgeoisie arrived. Luxury hotels around the world increasingly needed a stable, high-class, and unified transnational banqueting experience. It was against this backdrop that the famous French chef Auguste Escoffier emerged. He reorganized the modern kitchen, breaking down cooking, which had once relied on individual experience, into specialized stations for sauces, meats, desserts, and more. At the same time, he compiled vast amounts of culinary experience into systematized recipes. For the first time, haute cuisine broke free from the memory of individual chefs and turned into a professional system that people from any country could replicate anywhere in the world with precision. By the 20th century, the Michelin Guide changed the game even further. In the past, whether a dish was considered refined often relied on aristocratic status, a chef's reputation, or word of mouth among insiders. Michelin, however, began evaluating restaurants with stars, turning ambience, service, technique, and culinary skill into a shared set of criteria. From then on, people from different nations, even with distinct cultural backgrounds, could use the exact same set of rules to discuss whether a restaurant was excellent. Therefore, what France truly exported was never foie gras, cream, or any single classic dish. What it exported was a standard for defining fine dining. Looking back now at that spice-laden European banquet from 700 years ago, we might no longer think they simply didn't understand good food. Because flavor is never a fixed answer. In different eras, wealth shapes what people pursue. Knowledge shapes what people believe. Science reshapes how people understand the body. Technology reshapes what people are able to eat. Ultimately, what decides what counts as delicious is never a single ingredient, nor the people of any single era. Rather, it is the aesthetic standard co-shaped by the wealth, knowledge, power, and technology of an age.